students? Are you community folks? Just so I know how to kind of focus my remarks
They're
here.
law students, but they come from, they've been invited by 3 different associations.
Okay.
And the first one is the Environmental Law Society, right, Joe?
That's correct, and also the Public Interest Law Association and the Student Health Law Association.
Okay, dynamite. All right, terrific.
Oh, and then we have to give special recognition to the sustainability, because the whole Georgia State relationship is designed in sustainability. And she said, I'm gonna beat you to a puff if you don't mention that.
Yeah, so kudos to all of those things and to the very critical work that you're all doing. I come at this myself really from a community point, and I trained as a medical doctor, and very early on in the clinic, I saw that I was basically giving people pills and pushing them back out to the things that were making them sick. At the time I had young kids, so I was seeing this in the community too, as well as in the clinic where I was working with, it was basically a college clinic, so I was seeing young people just sort of at the transition between youth and adulthood. And I was just so struck that what we're seeing today, what's impacting virtually everybody, 50% almost of Americans now have a chronic disease of one sort or another, whether it's high blood pressure or a learning disability or asthma or obesity or diabetes. This is the norm. And it wasn't, in my day growing up, it wasn't the norm. And I just began to feel very strange about giving people pills that kind of make you bankrupt anyhow, that you can't afford and give you side effects and don't really fix you up. They just enable you to kind of keep treading water in a very sick system. So I began to work with community groups basically, and sort of becoming a physician advocate who could help do the research and testify before regulatory boards and the legislature and all that about why we needed to clean up the coal plants or to shut down the incinerators, and why in fact that could be transformed into things that our communities need that are actually good for us. How we could have recycling programs, for example, and product design, so that you have sort of life cycle design products that don't make toxic waste to start with. And this is good for workers, it's good for communities, and it could create a whole lot of jobs too. Not only recycling to deal with the issues of the waste stream and the toxicity of it and all that, but certainly in the energy field as well, that we could be, creating solar and wind and geothermal and lots of jobs insulating our homes and weatherization and stuff like that. So my first, I guess, I cut my teeth really on the struggle of communities to protect themselves. And of course, the worst facilities are always located in the most vulnerable communities, and environmental racism and pollution and the economy, they just go hand in hand. And for years, I was on that treadmill. And then, we had some successes, and we shut down some very toxic facilities. And we changed some rules at the state level so that, for example, we outlawed further incinerators, and instead we were going to have, landfills, which is a little better, but not all that better, because all landfills leak and, create other hazards. So we could only go so far within the system. Then many groups. So first it was, defensive and fighting back, and helping to train communities. And I was part of an effort with Physicians for Social Responsibility to create a manual for protecting communities, so-called Toxic Threats to Child Development in Harm's Way, which we just put out there saying, hey, we're docs, we can read this literature, we know how to protect our families, aren't we lucky? What about everybody else? So we were trying to help translate some of the science into everyday terms and help communities protect themselves. And then we were working with the legislature to try to get protections built in, so this wouldn't be after the fact. And it just, became really clear that the system was not responding. That's not what it does. It's not why it's there. And the most kind of no-brainer motherhood and apple pie things, like setting up jobs in renewable energy or weatherization, and in recycling and so on. That just wasn't going to happen. They weren't interested in that. Many groups got together at that point, several coalitions, labor, environment, public health, democracy reforms, and we passed campaign finance reform, thinking let's just get the money out of politics, and then maybe public health and the environment and communities will have a fighting chance. And we actually passed that, and within a few months, the legislature began to undo it, and then it was passed overwhelmingly as a public referendum. It was repealed by the legislature on voice vote, and we were right back where we started. And that's sort of how I made my transition from clinical medicine into political medicine, understanding that we really have, this is a political fight. This is fundamentally about who has power. Is it predatory banks and polluting fossil fuel companies and war profiteers? That's who's sort of running the political system. And they're not going to just throw in the towel because you ask them nicely. You know, this is a power struggle. And so those things, you know, continue to sort of inform my way forward. And I feel like I'm a sort of a political therapist, trying to help people, you know, and help groups find their political power, help lift up the struggles of frontline communities for clean air and clean water and for affordable housing, and to really help, you know, make the point that we are whole people and we live in whole societies. We cannot allow ourselves to be sort of pigeonholed into single issue or single, you know, policy goals. They really need to be very broad. As a health provider, nobody ever comes into your clinic, or we ourselves never go to our health providers and say, please just take care of my kidneys, you know, and forget about all the rest of me. You know, we are whole people. We need jobs, you know, we need housing. We need to abolish poverty and police violence and racism, and these are joint struggles, and they're also the only way that we move forward. If we are divided into many different pigeonholes, we are divided and conquered. So it's very much a political battle. There's a saying from, I think, like 17th century sailors that we have to, when the ship is in a storm, you need one hand for yourself and you need one hand for the ship. So we need the expertise, you know, we need the this very specific struggles against gentrification, against the Trans-Pacific Partnership that will send our jobs overseas and undermine public health protections. We need to fight all of these battles individually, but we also need a broader movement and a political voice for that movement that brings us together. And one of the mottos for me is people, planet, and peace over profit. Right now our system is basically driven by profit and to the detriment of our health, our economies, global peace and security. And I'll just make one last comment here and then we'll open it up. Going into Paris, you know, the expectation was that we were going to focus on climate, but kind of walking in with at least one hand tied behind our backs to start with, because the process is very much controlled and has been increasingly over the past several years by, you know, fossil fuel companies who basically run the show and are inside and are very much working shoulder to shoulder with the delegates, whereas civil society has been locked out and increasingly excluded from discussions and interaction, and now, given the terrible, tragic events in Paris, won't even have a means of expressing that. So it's really hard to say what's going to happen in Paris. But in many ways, it is such a symbol of where we are as a society and a world that we can no longer ignore the issues of global justice, global peace and security. They have come home to Paris and really come to our shores. Paris, just followed Beirut and Baghdad by day. So these are global problems. And so much of the terrorist, problem has been created by a disastrous U.S. foreign policy, which created ISIS. And we can talk more about that if you'd like, but there's no question about the connection between failed states and the fanning of the flames of terrorist crisis. So we've had a foreign policy based on oil and markets and total domination in order to achieve that. That is blowing back at us. We are not going to be able to solve the climate problem unless we are also solving this issue of global peace and security, which is how the circle completes itself, because if we move to 100% clean renewable energy, then we don't need those friggin' wars for oil, and they can no longer be justified. So, the connection between energy, economy, democracy, the environment, peace and security, they are really joined at the hip. And we can't pretend to just deal with one of them at a time. We really need a comprehensive solution as big as the crisis barreling down on us. And between, the growing crisis of failed states, terrorism, threats that we have created going back to Al-Qaeda, the refugee crisis of 60 million, about to become 100 million and more as the climate crisis proceeds. The biggest, the biggest purveyor of violence world over, in the words of Martin Luther King, is the United States of America. We need to come to terms with that and put it to an end. But in addition, the biggest emitter of carbon dioxide, is the war industry and the Department of Defense, which is another reason why we cannot solve the climate problem without also solving the war problem. However, if we all agreed, for starters, to cut our military, and I think the US should cut our military. We can talk about how to deal with ISIS if you're interested in that, but militarization has created ISIS. It's not the solution to ISIS. There are much smarter and more effective ways to deal with ISIS, like withdrawing their funding and their armaments. We are supplying 80% of the weapons to both sides in the Middle East. And our friends, the Saudis, are funding them. So we have within our power the ability to shut down the true threats to global health, peace, and security. By cutting the military, we then have the funds we need not only to transition to 100% clean renewable energy by 2030, which is the time frame in which it should be solved, but we then have the funding to help the rest of the world do it too, and the undeveloped world, which is bearing the burden of the climate crisis without having caused it. So there are solutions that can actually fix this. Fix it for the economy by creating jobs. We're calling for a Green New Deal here in the US, which would create 20 million jobs, provide the right to work for everyone at living wages, a full-time job. So it solves the economic crisis while it declares the climate emergency and solves the climate problem by 2030, having converted 100% to then, which requires a true emergency mobilization, and it essentially solves the war problem. We are spending, the US alone is spending $1 trillion renovating our nuclear weapons and their modes of delivery over the next couple of decades. That is as much of a threat to global survival as the climate crisis and the environmental crisis. So by doing the right thing on nuclear weapons, we actually recoup an enormous amount of money that can enable us to ensure that all countries have the ability to create essentially a global Green New Deal right now. So there is a way forward, but it really requires us to stand up and insist on the solutions that that we deserve and that are within our reach. And the last thing I'll just make by way of quick comment is that the younger generation has always played a critical role in social transformation at times of crisis, whether it's the civil rights movement or the the Arab Spring, the labor movement. It's always been the younger generation that kind of has the courage and the vision to act on what needs to be done. But right now we have a younger generation that's basically held hostage by a thing called student debt. There's no reason, if we could bail out the bankers who caused the crisis to the tune of $17 trillion, why can we not bail out the students to the tune of $1.3 trillion?
Applause.
And this is something not just to do for young people, but this is something to do for all of society, because we cannot envision our way to the future without a crop of fresh blood and protoplasm to see reality the way it is, that it takes the fresh vision of a younger generation. So no society ever survived by devouring its young, but that's kind of what's going on right now. So to my mind, that issue is wrapped up in this too. We need a just economy, and in many ways that must begin with canceling student debt, which is as easy to do as writing a piece of paper and saying, the U.S. absorbs that debt, and poof, it goes up in a cloud of smoke, in the same way that bank debt and corporate debt did too. If we can do it for the crooks, we need to do it for the, for the vibrant, heroes of the future. So it all comes together, and with that, let me open it up to your thoughts, and thank you for all that you're doing.
Okay, the acoustics in the room are not too bad, and so you can go ahead and ask your question, then you can repeat that question so the camera and microphone can pick it up, and then that's what we do.
Yeah, okay.
I'm one of those students on the
Yes,
My
exactly.
student debt will pay off to 2029. You are extremely motivating as far as looking at the government, and it's this huge machine, and it has so many parts, and yet you still have found ways to address everything. You do it in a very different way. How do you look at this big, messed up machine and still find hope that we can fix it? I mean, I think, for myself, I feel pretty defeated a lot of the time. I think about it, and frustrated, and sometimes cannot get my brain to switch around the other way and say, well, wait a minute, how do you, I guess my question is, how do you approach it so that you have a more positive attitude?
Great.
How do you see that
Great.
little thing?
Great. Yeah, so the question is basically, how do you get out of the mindset of being powerless in a very complicated and kind of diabolical system that tells you several times a day how powerless you are, and that the people running the show, are these incredibly scary, psychopathic personalities. Totally, like more and more. It's like our political system has become completely unhinged from anything with a beating heart, or any kind of semblance of reality. And I think there are a whole bunch of reasons why I really set that aside as a very false parallel universe that is collapsing right now. It is not real. And if you even look at polls, you see, like to look at political polls, membership in the current political parties now, 21% in Republicans, 29% as Democrats. And I don't just mean official members, but people who identify as those parties. Whereas it's 50% now of people who have rejected the political establishment entirely. 50%. Polls say that 60% of people are clamoring for an independent political party. The political system works overtime to shut down challenge. And we see this going on in Georgia, in North Carolina, which are two of the hardest states in which independent or third parties are basically kept off the ballot. We're kept out of debates, we're kept out of coverage. When the first time I was tricked into running for office, because I was in exactly the same mindset. I had never been part of a political struggle. I was kind of an academic and a healthcare professional and working within that little silo. It's a very depressing place to be. But once you begin connecting with other silos that are actually much bigger and way more fired up, you discover how incredibly numerous we are. And not to mention the fact that the progressive issues, whether it's living wages, cutting the military, healthcare as a human right, taking really concerted action on climate, those are all supported in the polls enormously. Why don't we move, why is that not reflected in our political system? Because we have an oppressive and illegitimate political system, which relies on suppressing the vote, on denying people their choices, and then denying people knowledge of who their choices are. And in the first race, where I was tricked into running for office, and the reason I got political was because nothing else was working. And this was back in the 90s, after much time doing all the right things, thinking, gosh, we're healthcare providers. We got all this research. We can show that this is economically great. The communities want it, but still the legislature moves in the opposite direction, not forward. Same thing congressionally, And then I got recruited by a political party that said, well, why don't you just do what you're doing and call it a political campaign? Because I wanted nothing to do with politics. And I said, well, might as well try that. Nothing else is working. So out of desperation, I ran for office for the first time and discovered that people out there can smell a rat. And if you are not one of them, they know that, whether they have time to be educated on the issues or not. We fought our way into a debate, into a televised debate, because people were outraged at what they were hearing from Tweedledum and Tweedledee, and this was back in even the year 2002, when things weren't nearly as bad as they are now, on just about all regards. We fought our way into a debate, so they said, okay, you can get into one televised debate. And it took place in a TV studio, so no real audience. And the ideas that I put forward about health and justice and demilitarization, they went over like lead balloons, not even worthy of rebuttal. And so I walked out of the debate thinking, oh, well, I tried, it's just not the right time. And when I walked out, I was mobbed by the press, who told me I had won the debate on the instant online viewer poll, at which time I was immediately yanked out of additional debates, and that was the last time they ever did an instant online viewer poll in a debate, because we have the power. I mean, for me, that was a transformational moment where I realized that we have already won in the court of public opinion. Most people are in agreement with the basic agenda of health, justice, ending racism, stopping police violence, ending militarism and imperialism. Most people actually agree with that, which is why the system clings all the harder to the means of communication and tries to silence us. So I realized the name of the game is getting organized. It's not about persuading people. People are already with us, and the last people we should try to persuade are elected officials. Our job is to basically unelect elected officials who cannot see their way to understanding that our survival depends on justice, democracy, and sustainability.